Now we're in the mechanical room and going to take a look at the heat pump that's installed. And this actually was installed in 2016. And a little permit research prior to coming to the home, I knew that this was actually permitted. So what I generally do is I'm taking photos of the data plate, manufacturer's data plate, so that I can get the information off of it on the size of the air handler, the date that it was installed, and importantly, in our standards of practice, we're required to identify the heat output of the system. So the newer systems have to be marked, and they are supposed to be identified on what their output is. This happens to be a 5 kW system. So when I'm looking at the system, I'm usually taking a look first once it's running. So I want to see if there's any air that's exposed around the actual system, looking at the return. I also will take a look to identify and make sure that they have what's called the safety float switch, which is installed on newer systems. And it's important that if it's not installed, then you would want to recommend that they have a safety float switch installed. And what that does is it will cut the system off in the air conditioning mode. For instance, if the condensate line gets backed up, you don't want the condensate to overflow into living space. So it's real important that you identify whether it has a safety switch or not. The other thing that we're looking at is the condensate line, which runs from here to the exterior by the condenser outside. This actually doesn't have a trap installed, which I would make sure that you identify. This clearly says it should be trapped. A lot of times this is installed through the concrete slab, so you can't see the actual trap, but in this particular case it does not. It's identified as going out to the exterior, and you can see from the exterior wall that there is no trap installed. So once I'm taking a look at this, I also want to check to make sure that they have a filter installed. It's hard to see from this particular angle. They do have a filter in there. It's extraordinarily dirty, so I would recommend replacement of the filter. You never want to run a system without a filter installed, and if there was not a filter, I would also identify that. I'm also looking at the refrigerant line. I think I mentioned in the attic, you want to make sure that the insulation is installed on the refrigerant line all the way from the condenser outside to the air handler. The air handler that was in the attic is a secondary system, so we didn't talk much about that. It's non-functional. The other thing, once I've done everything I need to do in here, I'm going to go in and look at the return after I've had the air conditioning running for a certain period of time. Now, on that note, with the heat pump, my recommendation is I would not run in AC mode if the temperature is below 65 degrees outside. On the opposite side, if the temperature is above 65 degrees outside, I would not run it in the heat pump mode. The heat pump actually, it has a reversing valve at the condenser, and the refrigerant just changes directions through the reversing valve. So it is hard on a system to actually run it if the ambient temperature outside is above 65 degrees. You don't really want to run it in heat mode. You might test it in emergency heat mode, which is your electric strips then installed inside the air handler, where the air handler alone would run without the condenser. But while I'm in the mechanical room, we'll also make mention of this water heater, which is extraordinarily old and rusted, and information on the data plate, which you also want to make sure goes into your report on the size of the unit, the age of the unit, and any deficiencies you see. For instance, the electrical, which should be in a conduit with a disconnect within sight. You also want to make sure that your temperature pressure relief valve is properly installed. And this unit does not have a pan under it, and it's inside living space, so it's real important that a pan be installed underneath of this. This actually has an old heat recovery system which is not connected to the heat pump. It's a system that was used back before 2000, so once you installed the newer heat pump, this became obsolete, so it's running just on electrical.